They laughed when the old man said he used to wear the badge, but no one laughed the day the sheriff brought it back. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. And if you still believe a man's worth isn't written on his clothes, stay with me, because this story doesn't raise its voice. It just stands there and waits for you to notice. The sun sat low over Red Hollow, burning through dust that never settled, turning every shadow long and every truth harder to see. And in that quiet stretch of street where boots sounded louder than words, Sheriff Ethan Cole stepped out of his office with something wrapped in a cloth that looked too careful for something so small. Folks noticed, of course they did, because nothing moved in Red Hollow without being weighed and judged, but no one asked. Not yet. Not when Ethan walked past the saloon, past the barber, past the men who tipped their hats to him, and the ones who didn't. His pace steady, eyes forward, like he was carrying more than just an object, like he was carrying a decision already made. Down by the edge of town, where the boards warped and the fences leaned like they were tired of standing, Walter Haynes sat on an overturned crate beside a broken trough, his coat too thin for the morning chill, his hat pulled low not for style, but for habit, the kind that comes from years of being looked at and not seen. They called him things, soft enough to pretend it wasn't cruelty, loud enough for him to hear anyway. And every now and then he'd mutter about a badge, about law, about a time when men stood up straight because they had to, not because someone told them to, and the children would snicker, and the grown men would shake their heads, because a story repeated too many times starts to sound like a lie. Ethan stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see the tremor in Walter's hands, the way his eyes didn't quite focus until something gave them reason, and for a second the wind moved between them, carrying the smell of leather and old wood, carrying the silence that comes before something shifts. Ethan didn't announce himself, didn't clear his throat, didn't ask a question. He just unwrapped the cloth slowly, like time mattered, like the moment needed room to breathe. And in his palms sat a badge, dull with age, edges worn smooth, the kind of metal that had seen years it didn't talk about. Walter's eyes lifted, not fully, just enough to catch the shape of it. And something behind those tired pupils stirred, something that had been waiting without hope of being called. Around them, a few townsfolk slowed, boots dragging just a little, conversations thinning into quiet glances, because even in a place like Red Hollow, people could feel when a line was about to be crossed. Ethan stepped forward, closed the distance, and placed the badge into Walter's hand without a word, and the old man's fingers curled around it like they remembered something his mind had been denied for years. And for the first time anyone could recall, Walter Haynes began to rise. Walter Haynes did not stand the way a strong man stands, not at first, but like something remembering how, slow, uncertain, as if the ground beneath his boots had not belonged to him in years, and the badge in his hand caught a sliver of sunlight that no one in Red Hollow could ignore. The murmurs started low, like wind slipping through cracks in old wood, then grew sharper, names whispered, doubts spoken louder than they should have been, because people do not like it when something they decided long ago begins to change without their permission. Ethan Cole said nothing, did nothing more, just stepped back half a pace, giving the old man space as if this moment was not his to own but his to return, and that difference hung in the air heavier than any explanation could. Walter's fingers traced the edge of the badge, slow, deliberate, the way a man might read something written in a language only his hands remembered, and his shoulders, bent for so long under the weight of dismissal, began to lift inch by inch until his spine straightened just enough to make a few men in the crowd shift their footing without knowing why. Someone near the saloon let out a dry chuckle, the kind meant to break tension, but it died quickly when Walter raised his eyes, not wide, not angry, just steady, and that steadiness carried something unfamiliar, something that did not match the image they had held of him for years. "Hey, boy," no older than 12, whispered to his father, asking if the old man was really someone important, and the father did not answer right away, because he was looking at Ethan, waiting for a sign, a denial, a laugh, anything that would restore the order he understood, but Ethan only adjusted his hat slightly and kept his gaze on the horizon, as if the answer had already been given and it was not his place to repeat it. The wind shifted again, carrying dust across the street, brushing against boots and coat hems, and in that passing moment, Walter took a full step forward, not away from the crowd, but into the open space between them, and that single step felt louder than any shout. He did not speak of the past, did not claim anything, did not defend the stories that had been used against him. He simply stood there holding the badge, and in that silence, the town began to feel something it had not felt in a long time: uncertainty. One of the older men, a ranch hand who had been in Red Hollow longer than most, squinted as if trying to place a memory just out of reach. Something about a name carved on a door, a voice that once carried weight, a presence that made arguments end before they began, but the thought slipped away before it could fully form. Ethan finally turned, not toward the crowd but toward the street that led out of town, and he started walking, boots measured, unhurried, leaving behind a scene he had set into motion without ever explaining. And that was when Walter's grip tightened slightly around the badge, and for a brief second, his reflection appeared in its worn surface, not as the man they had known, but as someone they had never taken the time to see. The town did not move right away, because when something you believed for years begins to slip, your body forgets what to do next, and Red Hollow stood there caught between what it knew and what it was starting to see, watching Walter Haynes hold that badge like it belonged to him in a way no one could take back. A woman near the general store pulled her shawl tighter, not from cold but from the quiet pressing in around her, and a man beside her cleared his throat twice before deciding not to speak at all, because words suddenly felt too small for what was unfolding. Walter turned the badge slightly in his hand, letting the light catch the worn engraving, and though the letters were faded, there was enough left for anyone close enough to read. Enough for a name to stop being a rumor and start becoming something heavier, something that demanded to be reconsidered. He looked down at it for a long moment, not with pride, not with sorrow, but with a kind of recognition that runs deeper than either, like a man seeing a piece of himself returned after it had been set aside by others. Then he lifted his gaze again, scanning the faces in front of him one by one, not accusing, not searching for apology, just seeing them as they were, and that simple act made several people shift uncomfortably, because it is easier to ignore a man than to be seen by him. Near the edge of the crowd, the old ranch hand stepped forward half a pace, his brow furrowed as if something inside him was finally finding its place, and he spoke softly, almost to himself, saying the name Walter Haynes in a tone that carried memory instead of doubt, and that was enough to ripple through the others, not loudly, not all at once, but like water disturbed by a single drop. Ethan Cole was already halfway down the street by then, his figure growing smaller against the stretch of sunlit dust, but he slowed just slightly when he heard that name spoken differently, not as a joke, not as a dismissal, but as something real, and though he did not turn around, the corner of his mouth tightened in a way that suggested the moment had reached exactly where it was meant to. Back in the open space, Walter took another step, then another, until he stood fully upright in the middle of the street, no longer on the edge, no longer part of the background the town had grown used to ignoring, and he slipped the badge carefully into the inside pocket of his coat, not hiding it, but placing it where it belonged, close, protected, acknowledged. The silence that followed was different now, not empty, but full of questions no one had the courage to ask, and in that silence, a young boy took a small step forward, looking up at Walter with something that had not been there before, not fear, not amusement, but respect that did not yet have words. Walter noticed, just briefly, and gave the slightest nod, the kind that passes without drawing attention but leaves a mark all the same. And then he turned toward the street Ethan had taken, his pace slow but steady, as if following a path that had been waiting for him to remember it existed. Walter did not hurry, and that was the first thing Ethan Cole noticed when he finally glanced back from the far end of the street, not fully turning, just enough to see the shape of a man who had spent years being overlooked now walking with a purpose that did not need to prove itself. The distance between them stretched close to 100 yards, dust lifting in soft clouds with every step Walter took, but there was no hesitation in his pace, no sign of the frailty the town had grown used to assigning him, only a quiet steadiness that made the space feel smaller with each passing second. Behind him, Red Hollow remained still, not frozen, but unwilling to interrupt what it did not yet understand, and the usual sounds of the place, the creak of wood, the low murmur of conversation, the clink of glass from the saloon, all seemed to fall back as if they knew they did not belong in this moment. Walter reached the center of the street and paused, just briefly, his hand brushing the inside of his coat where the badge rested, not checking if it was still there, but acknowledging it, like a man who had been given something back that he never stopped carrying in another way. He lifted his head slightly, eyes narrowing against the sun, and for a moment he looked not at the buildings or the people, but beyond them, towards something only he could measure, and whatever he saw there settled into him like a decision already made long ago. Ethan waited, not because he had to, but because leaving too soon would have felt like breaking something that had just begun to take shape. And so he stood at the edge of town with one hand resting lightly near his belt, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if he understood that what came next did not require authority, only presence. When Walter resumed walking, the gap between them closed slowly, each step carrying the weight of years that had not been spoken about. And when he finally stopped a few feet away from Ethan, neither man spoke right away, because some exchanges do not begin with words. A faint breeze moved between them, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant water, and Walter looked at Ethan not with gratitude, not with confusion, but with a quiet recognition, the kind that does not ask for explanation because it already understands enough. Ethan met his gaze for a moment, then lowered his eyes slightly, a small gesture, almost invisible, but it held more respect than anything he could have said out loud, and that was when Walter gave the slightest nod, not as a request, not as permission, but as acknowledgement that whatever had been set into motion was now shared. From the far side of the street, someone finally found their voice, asking in a tone that tried to sound casual why the sheriff had done it, why he had chosen that man, that moment, that object. But the question did not travel far, it dissolved before it reached them, because neither Ethan nor Walter turned to answer, and in that absence of response, the town felt something settle into place, something heavier than curiosity. Ethan shifted his stance and stepped aside, not blocking the road, not leading, simply making space, and Walter moved past him without breaking stride, heading toward the open land beyond Red Hollow, the same land he had likely walked long before most of the town had ever arrived. And as he passed, the edge of his coat brushed lightly against Ethan's sleeve, a brief contact that carried no force, only confirmation. Ethan watched him go this time, fully, his eyes following the old man's figure as it moved farther out, growing smaller against the horizon. And though nothing had been explained, nothing had been declared, the air itself seemed to hold a quiet understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be known. The road beyond Red Hollow did not welcome men. It simply allowed them to pass, stretching wide and dry under a sky that gave no answers, and Walter Haynes walked into it without looking back, his figure steady against the open land, as if each step was reclaiming something no one else had known was taken. Behind him, the town slowly began to breathe again, but it was not the same breath as before. It carried hesitation now, and the weight of something left unsaid. Ethan Cole remained where he was for a moment longer, watching until Walter became smaller against the horizon, until the outline of him blurred into heat and distance, and only then did Ethan turn back toward Red Hollow, his boots pressing into the same dust that had just witnessed something it could not explain. As he stepped onto the wooden walkway outside his office, the boards creaked under his weight, familiar, predictable, unlike the silence that had settled over the street. A man near the hitching post finally spoke up, asking again, louder this time, what that had been about. What kind of sheriff hands over a badge to someone like that? And a few others nodded, not in agreement, but in need of something to hold on to, something that would make sense of what they had just seen. Ethan paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame, not turning to face them fully, just enough to let his voice carry without effort. And when he spoke, it was low, even, the kind of tone that did not invite argument, but did not demand silence either. He said that some things are not lost, they are just set aside by people who stop looking closely. And then he stepped inside, leaving the words hanging in the air like dust that would take its time to settle. Inside the office, the light filtered through the window in thin lines, catching on the edges of old papers and worn wood, and Ethan moved to the desk where the town records were kept, the same place where he had found the name that did not belong in the past the way everyone thought it did. He opened the drawer slowly, not searching this time, but confirming, and inside lay the folder he had read more than once, the one marked with dates that did not match the story Red Hollow had told itself for years. His fingers rested on it for a moment, then closed the drawer again without taking it out, as if the truth did not need to be shown to be real. Outside, the town began to shift, small movements at first. A hat tipped differently. A glance held a second longer than usual. A conversation that did not end with laughter, and near the edge of the street, the young boy who had stepped forward earlier stood watching the road where Walter had gone, his posture straighter now, as if he had seen something worth remembering. An older man joined him, the ranch hand whose memory had stirred, and he said the name again, quietly this time. Walter Haynes, not as a question, not as a joke, but as something that deserved to be spoken carefully. The boy looked up at him and asked who that was, and the man hesitated, searching for words that would not reduce what had just happened into something simple, and after a moment, he answered that he was someone this town forgot how to see. Far out on the road, beyond the last fence post and the last piece of shade, Walter kept walking, the wind moving against his coat, the badge resting close to his chest, and though no one followed, no one called out, the path ahead did not feel empty. It felt known, like something waiting for him to arrive again. Morning came to Red Hollow the way it always did, slow and pale, sliding over rooftops and dry fences, but something in the light felt different, as if it was revealing more than it used to, and people noticed without saying so. Doors opened quieter, boots hit the ground softer, and conversations that usually started loud now began with glances, with pauses, with the kind of care that only comes after something has unsettled what was once certain. Ethan Cole stood by the window inside his office, looking out over the street that had already begun to move again, but not the same way, not with the same certainty, and his eyes drifted toward the road beyond town where the dust had long since settled, though the memory of a man walking into it had not. On his desk, the edges of old records caught the morning light, thin papers holding years that most had forgotten, and for a moment, Ethan rested his hand on them again, not to reopen, not to prove, but to acknowledge that some truths do not belong to the crowd, they belong to time. Outside, the young boy returned to the same spot near the edge of the street, standing where he had watched Walter disappear, his posture straighter than the day before, his eyes searching the horizon as if expecting something to come back, or perhaps understanding that not everything does. The old ranch hand joined him again, slower this time, carrying with him a memory that had begun to settle into something clearer, and he spoke quietly, not to correct the boy, not to explain everything, but to offer just enough, saying that long ago, before most of the buildings stood, there was a man who kept the peace not by raising his voice, but by standing where others would not, and the boy listened, not interrupting, not questioning, because something in the tone told him this was not a story meant to be challenged. Near the saloon, a group of men who once laughed the loudest now spoke lower, their words careful, circling around the same question they could not quite ask directly, and each time someone came close, another would shake his head slightly, as if to say leave it where it is, because pulling too hard at something like that might reveal more than they were ready to carry. Ethan stepped out onto the wooden walkway, the boards creaking under him in a way that felt familiar again, but he did not stop in the center of town this time. He did not call for attention. He simply stood there for a moment, letting the air settle, letting the town find its own balance without being told how. A woman passing by slowed just enough to nod to him, not out of habit, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement that had not been there before, and Ethan returned it with the slightest dip of his head, nothing more. Far beyond the last fence, where the land stretched open and the sky seemed wider, Walter Haynes had stopped walking for the first time since leaving town, not because he was tired, but because he had reached a place where the ground felt familiar under his boots, where the wind carried a different sound, one that did not belong to Red Hollow, but to something older, something steadier. He reached into his coat and took out the badge, holding it up so the morning light struck it again, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not in relief, not in regret, but in recognition, and when he opened them, there was no hesitation left in his gaze, only the quiet certainty of a man who no longer needed anyone to remember who he was, because he had already begun to walk as if he never forgot. The land does not forget, even when people do, and as Walter Haynes stood alone beneath that wide morning sky, The silence around him carried a weight that felt older than any town, older than any story told within wooden walls. He turned the badge once more between his fingers, not studying it now, but holding it the way a man holds something that has already proven its worth. And then he slipped it back into his coat with a motion that no longer trembled. The wind moved across the open ground, brushing against dry grass and distant hills, and Walter began to walk again, not toward anywhere marked on a map, but along a line only he seemed to recognize, a path worn not by feet, but by memory. Back in Red Hollow, the day stretched on, but it did not settle, not fully, because something had shifted beneath it, something quiet but firm, and people felt it in the way they spoke, in the way they looked at one another, in the spaces between their words. The boy remained near the edge of town longer than he had the day before, watching that same horizon, and when he finally turned away, it was slower, as if he was leaving behind more than just a view. The old ranch hand sat on a low bench nearby, hat tilted forward, eyes half closed, not sleeping, but thinking, and after a long while, he spoke again, softer than before, saying that a badge is not what makes a man stand tall. It is what a man has already carried before anyone ever sees it. The boy listened, then nodded once, not because he fully understood, but because something in him had begun to accept that not everything needs to be explained to be true. Ethan Cole spent most of the morning outside his office, not working in the usual way, not sorting papers or giving orders, but simply being present, watching how the town adjusted without being told to. And every so often, someone would meet his eyes and look away again, not out of defiance, but because they were unsure what to say now that what they thought they knew had changed. A woman who once crossed the street to avoid Walter now paused near the same broken trough where he used to sit, her hand resting lightly on the wood as if it held some trace of what had been overlooked, and after a moment, she moved on, her pace slower, her expression quieter. As the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across Red Hollow, the usual rhythms began to return, but they did not erase what had happened. They moved around it, adjusting, making space for something that no one had named, but everyone had felt. Out on the open land, Walter reached a small rise where the ground dipped gently beyond, and he stopped there, looking out over the stretch of earth that rolled into the distance. And for the first time since leaving town, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, the kind of breath that fills more than just the lungs, the kind that settles something inside a man. He reached into his coat again, but this time he did not take out the badge. He simply rested his hand over it, pressing it lightly against his chest, and his eyes softened, not with regret, not with longing, but with a quiet acceptance that did not need an audience. The wind passed once more, carrying with it the faint echo of a place behind him and the open promise of what lay ahead, and Walter Haynes stood there between the two, no longer defined by either, only by the way he chose to keep walking. By late afternoon, Red Hollow had returned to motion, but not to certainty, because something once invisible had been placed back into the center of its memory, and people could not quite step around it the way they used to. Shadows stretched longer again, crawling across wooden walls and dry ground, and in those shadows, conversations changed shape, no longer loud, no longer certain, but careful, as if each word now carried weight it did not have before. Ethan Cole stood outside the sheriff's office, hat tilted low against the lowering sun, watching without appearing to, the way a man does when he knows that what matters is not what people say, but what they choose not to. A pair of travelers rode through town, their horses kicking up light dust, and they slowed just slightly as they passed, sensing something unspoken in the air, something that made them lower their voices without knowing why. Near the broken trough where Walter had once sat day after day, the wood now stood empty, but it did not feel abandoned. It felt noticed, and a man who had once laughed there paused longer than he meant to, resting his hand on the edge, then pulling it back as if the gesture itself had meaning he was not ready to face. The boy returned again, as he had each hour since morning, not out of habit, but because something inside him had begun to measure time differently, and he stood looking out toward the open land, his small frame steady, his eyes searching not for a figure, but for understanding. The old ranch hand joined him once more, slower now, lowering himself onto the bench with a quiet exhale, and he did not speak right away, because some lessons do not come from telling, They come from letting the silence settle long enough for it to speak. When he finally did, his voice was softer than the wind, saying that a town does not lose its truth all at once. It forgets it in pieces, and sometimes it takes just one man walking away to make everyone else remember what they left behind. The boy listened, then looked down at his own hands, turning them over slowly as if trying to understand what they might hold one day. And when he looked back up, his gaze was different, steadier, as if he had decided something without needing to say it. Inside the sheriff's office, the light had shifted, casting long lines across the desk where the old records remained untouched, and Ethan stepped inside for only a moment, glancing at the drawer where the past rested quietly, then closing the door again without opening it, because he knew that not every truth needs to be shown to be carried forward. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in faded gold and long blue shadows, the town began to quiet, not from routine, but from reflection, and one by one, people turned toward their homes with slower steps, their thoughts heavier, their voices softer. Far beyond the reach of Red Hollow's dust and doubt, Walter Haynes stood once more at the edge of a long stretch of land, the horizon wide before him, and this time, he did not pause to look back, not even for a second, because whatever had tied him to that place had already been set down, returned, acknowledged. He adjusted his coat slightly, feeling the weight of the badge close to his chest, not as a burden, not as a symbol to prove anything, but as something simple, something true. And with that quiet certainty, he stepped forward again into the open, the wind moving past him, the land stretching ahead and behind him. Without a single word spoken, an entire town began to see differently. That night, Red Hollow did not sleep the way it used to, because silence, once empty, had turned into something that listened back, and even the smallest sounds seemed to carry farther than they should. Lamps glowed dim behind windows, casting soft rectangles of light onto the dust outside, and inside those rooms, people spoke in lower voices, not out of fear, but because something inside them had begun to weigh their words before letting them out. Ethan Cole remained awake longer than most, seated by his window with his hat resting beside him, watching the dark settle over the town, and every so often his eyes drifted toward the road that disappeared into the night, as if measuring distance not in miles, but in meaning. He did not open the records, did not revisit the names or dates, because he understood that what mattered had already moved beyond paper, beyond proof, into something quieter and harder to deny. Across town, the old ranch hand sat alone on his porch, rocking slowly in a chair worn smooth by years, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, yet seeing more than he had in a long time. And he spoke once into the night, not to anyone present, saying that a man can be forgotten by others, but never by the ground he once stood on. The words drifted into the darkness and disappeared, but they did not feel lost. Near the edge of town, the boy lay awake on a thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, his small hands resting on his chest, as if holding on to something he could not yet name, and in his mind, he replayed the moment. He had seen an old man stand up straight, not because he was told to, but because something inside him had been returned, and that image settled deep, quiet, and lasting. Far beyond the reach of lantern light and whispered questions, under a sky scattered with stars that did not belong to any one place, Walter Haynes had made a small fire, not for warmth, not for comfort, but as a point of stillness in the open land. He sat beside it, his posture calm, his breathing even, and for a long time, he said nothing, did nothing, just listened to the wind move across the ground, the same wind that had carried him away from a town that no longer held him the way it once did. After a while, he reached into his coat and brought out the badge again, turning it once in the firelight, watching how the worn metal caught the glow, not shining, but steady, like something that did not need to prove its value. He held it there for a moment, then closed his hand around it and lowered it slowly, resting it against his knee, and his eyes lifted toward the horizon, even in the dark, as if he could still see the line where one life ended and another began. Back in Red Hollow, a dog barked once and then fell quiet, and somewhere a door closed gently, and the town settled into a different kind of rest, one that did not erase the day, but carried it forward into whatever would come next. Ethan finally stood from his chair and stepped away from the window, extinguishing the lamp with a careful motion, And as the room fell into darkness, he paused just long enough to let the silence settle fully, as if acknowledging that some things, once set right, do not need to be spoken about again. Out on the open land, Walter Haynes remained by the fire, the badge close, the night wide around him, and though no one from the town could see him now, the quiet certainty in his stillness carried farther than any voice ever had. At first light, the land beyond Red Hollow held a quiet that did not belong to sleep, but to something steadier, something that had already decided what it was going to be before the sun even rose, and Walter Haynes sat. Where the last embers of his fire had faded into ash, his posture unchanged, his presence settled into the ground as if it recognized him. The sky shifted from deep blue to pale gold, and the horizon revealed itself slowly, not all at once, the way truth often does, and Walter watched it without urgency, without expectation, just allowing it to arrive. When he finally stood, it was not with effort, not with hesitation, but with the same quiet certainty that had carried him out of town, and he brushed the dust from his coat in a simple motion, not to clean it, but to mark the beginning of another stretch of road. He reached inside and touched the badge again, not taking it out this time, just confirming its place, and then he stepped forward, continuing along the line that only he seemed to follow. Back in Red Hollow, the morning began earlier than usual, not in noise, but in awareness, and people stepped outside with a different kind of attention, noticing things they had passed by for years without thought. The broken trough near the edge of town had been repaired overnight, though it fitted carefully, not perfectly, but with intention, and no one claimed the work, no one spoke of it, yet everyone who passed by slowed just slightly, recognizing the gesture for what it was. The boy stood there again, running his hand along the new boards, his fingers tracing the grain as if reading something written into it, and when he looked up, his gaze carried a quiet resolve that had not been there days before. The old ranch hand approached, leaning on his cane, and when he saw the repaired wood, he nodded once, not surprised, just acknowledging that some things begin to mend the moment they are seen clearly. Ethan Cole stepped out of his office as the sun rose higher, his eyes taking in the small changes without comment, because he understood that real shifts do not announce themselves, they appear in the details, in the things people choose to do when no one is asking. A man who had once turned his back on Walter paused near the trough, adjusted his hat, and stood there for a long moment before moving on, and though he said nothing, the pause itself carried more meaning than any apology would have. The town moved, but differently, slower in some ways, steadier in others, as if it was learning how to carry something it had nearly forgotten how to hold. Far beyond the last fence, where the land opened wide and the air carried no memory of Red Hollow's voices, Walter continued walking, his figure small against the rising light, but his presence unchanged, grounded, certain. The road did not guide him, the sky did not direct him, yet he moved as if both had always known where he belonged. The wind passed across his path, lifting the edge of his coat, and for a brief moment, the outline of the badge pressed faintly against the fabric, catching the light just enough to be seen, not by anyone nearby, but by the land itself, by the morning, by the quiet truth that had never needed to be spoken aloud. And as Red Hollow carried on behind him, reshaping itself in ways no one would fully explain, Walter Haynes walked forward into a day that did not ask who he was, because it already knew. By midday, the sun stood high over Red Hollow, pressing light into every corner, leaving fewer places for things to hide, and the town moved beneath it with a quiet awareness that had not been there before, as if each step now carried a question no one was willing to ignore anymore. Ethan Cole walked the length of the street without urgency, his boots steady against the boards and dust, and as he passed each doorway, each window, each face that turned toward him and then away again, he could feel the difference, not in what they said, but in what they no longer dismissed so easily. Near the repaired trough, the boy had begun to sit instead of stand, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze still drawn toward the open land, but no longer searching for a figure, rather holding onto the idea of one, and beside him, the old ranch hand spoke less now, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what mattered had already been placed where it needed to be. A woman approached the trough with a small bucket, filling it carefully, and setting it down even though no animals stood nearby. And when she finished, she paused, her fingers lingering on the edge of the wood, her expression thoughtful, as if she understood that some acts are not for use, but for meaning. Across the street, a man who once laughed the loudest adjusted his hat and looked out toward the horizon longer than necessary, his eyes narrowing not from the sun, but from something inside him trying to settle into place. And though he said nothing, his silence no longer felt empty. Ethan reached the far end of town and stopped where the dirt road stretched outward, the same line Walter had followed. And for a moment he stood there, not as a sheriff, not as a man responsible for others, but simply as someone who had chosen to return something that was never his to keep. The wind moved past him, carrying the dry scent of open land, and he closed his eyes briefly, not in reflection, but in acknowledgement, as if confirming that what had been done required nothing further. Far beyond the last trace of Red Hollow, where the land rolled in quiet waves beneath the sky, Walter Haynes continued forward, his pace unchanged, his posture steady, and though no one walked beside him, there was no sense of absence, only a completeness that did not depend on being seen. He paused once more at a rise in the land, not to rest, but to look, and the horizon stretched wide before him, unbroken, unclaimed, and he reached into his coat, not to check the badge, but to feel its presence, a simple weight, nothing more, nothing less. His hand rested there for a moment, then fell away, and he took another step, and then another, each one quiet, each one certain, until the distance between him and the town became something that no longer needed to be measured. Back in Red Hollow, the day carried on, but it did so differently, not louder, not faster, but steadier, as if the town had begun to remember something it had almost lost, not in words, not in stories, but in the way it now chose to see what stood right in front of it. As the sun began its slow descent, stretching shadows long across Red Hollow, the town found itself quieter than it had ever been at that hour, not from emptiness, but from something settling deeper than routine, something that did not need to be named to be felt. Ethan Cole stood once more at the edge of the road, the same place where dust met distance, his posture relaxed, his presence steady, and for a moment he removed his hat, letting the breeze pass over his face as if acknowledging something beyond the reach of words. Behind him, the town moved with a different kind of care, doors closing softer, footsteps measured, voices lower, as if everyone understood that something had been returned, not just to one man, but to the way they chose to see one another. Near the trough, now filled and maintained without discussion, the boy sat again. But this time he was not looking out toward the horizon. He was looking inward, his hands resting calmly, his shoulders no longer tense, and beside him, the old ranch hand remained silent, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the lesson had already taken root. A woman passed by and paused briefly, offering a small nod to the boy, not out of habit, but with quiet recognition, and he returned it without hesitation, as if he understood that respect is not something given by age, but by awareness. Across the street, a man who once dismissed Walter entirely stood still for a long moment, then adjusted his stance, standing a little straighter, not for anyone watching, but because something inside him had shifted, something that no longer allowed him to remain as he was. Ethan placed his hat back on and turned slightly, his gaze moving across the town not to inspect, not to judge, but to witness, and in that moment, it was clear that what he had done was not about correcting the past, but about allowing the present to carry it differently. Far beyond the last fence, where the land rolled into quiet openness and the sky stretched without interruption, Walter Haynes continued forward, his steps unhurried, his presence grounded, and though the distance between him and Red Hollow had grown too great for either to see the other, the connection had not disappeared, it had simply changed form. He paused once more as the light softened, not out of doubt, not out of need, but because the land beneath him felt familiar in a way that did not require memory, and he stood there, his hand resting lightly over his coat where the badge remained, not as a symbol of what he had been, but as something that had never stopped being true. The wind moved gently across the ground, carrying no voices, no echoes, only the quiet certainty of open space, and Walter lifted his gaze toward the fading horizon, his expression calm, his posture steady, as if he had stepped fully into a life that did not depend on being remembered. Back in Red Hollow, as the light dimmed and lamps began to glow once more, the town did not speak of what had happened, not directly, but in the way they moved, in the way they paused, in the way they chose to look instead of turn away. It became clear that something had been restored, not loudly, not forcefully, but in the only way that ever lasts, quietly, and without asking for recognition. The night settled over Red Hollow one more time, but it did not feel the same as before, because something once misplaced had found its way back without asking for recognition, and that kind of change does not fade with the light. It stays, quiet and steady, beneath everything that follows. Lamps glowed behind windows again, but softer now, less like signals and more like presence, and inside those rooms, people moved with a different kind of awareness, not speaking of what had happened, but carrying it in the way they paused, in the way they listened, in the way they chose not to look away. Ethan Cole stood outside his office for a final moment before stepping in, his gaze drifting once more toward the road that led beyond the town, not searching, not expecting, but acknowledging that some paths do not return and do not need to. He adjusted his hat slightly, then turned, closing the door behind him with a quiet finality that did not end anything, but simply marked that what had needed to be done was already complete. Near the trough, the boy rose from his seat, no longer lingering, no longer waiting, and as he walked back toward his home, his steps were steady, his shoulders squared in a way that did not come from instruction, but from understanding, and the old ranch hand watched him go with a faint nod, recognizing the shift not in words, but in posture, in presence, in something that would carry forward long after the moment itself had passed. Across the street, a man who once laughed too easily now tipped his hat to no one in particular, a small gesture, almost unnoticed, but honest, and that was enough. The town did not change all at once, it never does, but something had taken root, something that would grow in small ways, in quiet ways, in the choices made when no one was watching. Far beyond the reach of Red Hollow, where the land opened into silence and the sky stretched without boundary, Walter Haynes walked beneath the fading light, his figure steady, his path unbroken, and though the distance between him and the town had grown too vast for either to touch the other again, the connection remained, not in memory, not in story, but in something simpler, something truer. He stopped once more as the last light dipped below the horizon, not to look back, not to measure what had been, but to stand fully in what was, and his hand rested lightly over his coat where the badge remained, not as a symbol, not as proof, but as something that had always belonged, even when no one else could see it. The wind moved across the open land, carrying no names, no questions, only the quiet certainty of space and time, and Walter stood there, calm, grounded, complete, before taking another step forward into the dark that was not empty, but full of everything that no longer needed to be explained. And back in Red Hollow, without a single word spoken, without a single story retold, the town learned something it would carry long after the dust had settled, that a man does not become worthy when others recognize him. He simply remains who he has always been, until someone finally chooses to see it.